Deborah, thank you. Thank you all for joining us for this event. Thank you to our partners. Now, this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I really look forward to listening to today's panel. But I'll begin with a few framing remarks. My first point is that the COVID-15 or COVID-19 pandemic has shown a very bright light on what is a huge collective failure for the global community to respond to what should have been a very predictable crisis, but we didn't. It should have been a wake-up call, but we are right now in danger of sleepwalking toward what should be a very, very predictable crisis. What we've seen, though, is that UN initiatives like the one currently underway, voluntary initiatives aimed at dealing with this biodiversity loss, have rather than making a difference, they've made no progress. They've identified the problem, but the problem has accelerated. We are seeing the loss of species, extinctions at 1,000 times the historical rate. If we continue on this pace, we're going to lose half the species on the planet by the middle of this century. And you've got to ask yourself why. Why have these voluntary UN initiatives been so inadequate? What's going on here? I think the reason is pretty clear, and that is that our economic systems, our political systems, our financial markets do not put a value on the services that nature provides. It's hard to put a value on some of the natural services, no doubt about it. But the fact that we don't put a value on it means that they're essentially treated as a free good, and policymakers very often treat them as if as if the value is zero. And so, what does this mean? This means that actions that conserve biodiversity, are not rewarded. Actions that destroy or damage biodiversity are not penalized. So it's pretty clear that we need some kind of framework to really mobilize the global community to make a real difference before it's too late. And so we need to, I would say in this order, value, protect, and restore biodiversity or restore natural capital. And I emphasize those in that order, because if we don't value something, we're not going to protect it. And protecting it is much more important even than restoring it, because it's much cheaper to protect it in the first place than it is to have to restore it. But there's obviously great opportunities to restore nature. Now, the Paulson Institute, working with the Nature Conservancy and some other organizations, last year came up with a report that I think makes a very real difference. It's called Valuing Nature, and we've shown a light on the biodiversity funding gap here in this Financing Nature report. And what I liked about the report was we not only made a compelling case for putting an economic value on nature, but we went into a lot of detail in terms of the financing flows, the funding flows globally for biodiversity. And I think pretty much identified every policy and every financing mechanism and looked at them very pragmatically, analyzed them, what's worked, how effective have they been? And I recommend that you all read that report. But let me just very quickly now emphasize the three findings of the report. And I think they're pretty clear and they're pretty obvious. And the first one is that it's an essential role of government to give us a policy framework for protecting nature. And here I'm talking about not just policies, but regulations, subsidies, tax breaks, so that's the essential role of government. And, we put a value on the funding gap, but what stood out to me was that it would make a huge difference and it wouldn't require much new funding if governments did two things. One is taking a look at these dysfunctional subsidies. Now, we have dysfunctional subsidies in a number of areas, but the biggest area was ag. And the subsidies that incentivize production of ag products were just very, very harmful. And by restructuring, reordering those subsidies, there's a big, big opportunity. And to still have the ag production we need, and it makes a big difference. The second thing is, if the financial sector were required, or voluntarily, but I think required, to disclose how their borrowing, their lending activities or investment activities either impaired natural capital or conserved natural capital, that would make a big difference. So those are the two things that stood out to me. And without government acting, there's really not much that the private sector can do. They can do some things, but it'll be limited. But when you look at the private sector, you need to say the governments aren't going to have the funding they required. So with the right policy framework, there's a lot that the private sector can do. Now, I always emphasize to people, though, that the private sector capital isn't going to come in the size required to invest and get a loss. Investing in a loss or lending for there to be a loss is not a sustainable business model. But there are some real opportunities to do things. And, our report made a big deal out of securitizing asset classes. I think there's a lot of room for creativity by the private sector, looking at either productive soils or pollinators or watersheds. And I always like to use a watershed as an example because, New York City is just a real example. About 20 years ago, when they were looking at building a new water filtration plant, it would have cost $7.5 or $8 billion. And instead, they invested $1.5 billion in preserving the Catskills, the watershed there, and it made a big difference. I've done work with the Nature Conservancy, the Latin American Conservation Council of the Nature Conservancy in Latin America, where again, mayors and governors, and usually mayors, love to invest in gray infrastructure, right? In water treatment plants and pipelines and aqueducts and so on. But you get a bigger payback if you invest in green infrastructure and preserving watersheds. And so again, a real opportunity for the private sector to innovate. And I think there's a lot that can be done. The third point that came out of our study really placed an emphasis on urgency and, looking at where we are with the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's no doubt that this is just devastating parts of the world where we have the most biodiversity. If you look at what's happening in Latin America, for instance, a region which I follow very carefully, the health, what's going on in terms of the loss of life, the health crisis is devastating, and economics is also way down. It's going to take a lot of stimulus to help pull them out. And during a crisis, you find that there's a real emphasis on what is urgent as opposed to what is important. And our political system already is geared toward, toward short-term gains as opposed to long-term prosperity. But so we're at a situation where it's very, very important that, we all talk about the importance of environmental ministers. Environmental ministers are important and heads of state are important, but finance ministers more than ever need to understand the case for a green recovery. And there's a really strong case for a green recovery right now in terms of how investments in a green recovery pay off in terms of jobs, and it'll make a big difference in terms of attracting capital. So a big emphasis on the importance of getting finance ministers to buy in. So let me wrap up my framework by saying, this fall, we're going to see the CBD COP15 in Kunming, China. And I'm just assuming that will be declared a success, and it'll be important because governments will come together, they'll set targets, they'll set initiatives. And you know what? It'll be totally and completely meaningless unless there's action below that, unless you see the political will at the government level, the private sector level. I think we've got the tools to do this right now. We've got the tools. And I'll tell you, I had a long career in finance. I spent time in government. I've spent time with NGOs. I've spent a lot of time talking with CEOs around the world about conservation, biodiversity, preserving nature, and so on. And I've never seen more interest around this issue than I see today. So I see a real opportunity. And I see some of the things I see coming out of finance and big financial institutions and small financial institutions and fintech is all very exciting. So I see a real opportunity. I think this is, people overuse the word tipping point. I think there's a tipping point. There's a compelling economic case for preserving nature, but I don't want to end with the economic case, because I would just simply say this. When I look at the natural world, and I think there's an increased appreciation for people during the pandemic of the natural world, I look at the inspiration one can get from nature, the beauty, all the intellectual curiosity that this inspires in us. I think much of what is good about life is embodied in nature. So I think there's a real reason for protecting nature just for its own sake, but there is, this compelling economic interest. So Deborah, over to you and to your panel. And